It's not their fault that they don't understand, because almost nobody thinks this way. This is not the way our schools teach us. This is not the way that people are generally taught to interpret the world. This is not the way that all the talking heads and idiots on television tell us to think about our conceptual structure and our political reality. Bitcoin and gender. What the hell do those have to do with one another? Well, that's what this video is about. So for those of you who have seen any of my other content or who follow me on social media, you may be aware that I'm very interested in trying to discover and identify patterns that demonstrate specific types of behaviors as they emerge across different layers of our world, from the deeper realms of our evolutionary systems up into the social realities that we encounter today, from the physical world of quarks and neutrons up to the chemical world of molecules, and then how that turns into biology and how that becomes life, and how life gets different behaviors and how those behaviors interact with each other. This is all very intriguing to me, and if I can find similarities across these patterns, or if I can find patterns that I think hold or seem to hold or appear at many of these different layers across all different types of systems that you would think are unrelated to one another, that have nothing to do with one another, just like Bitcoin and gender. If there are patterns there that seem almost identical, I think that says something. I think that tells us something. And I think that if we can find those, and then we can see how natural systems tend to deal with these problems, or these complexities of reality, that can give us some insight into how we might most effectively handle these situations ourselves. And not just effectively, but also ethically, and with compassion and a deep understanding of the complexity of the reality that we live within. And so I think that exists here with Bitcoin and gender. And before I go into exactly what I think that parallel is, for those of you who are not exactly familiar with Bitcoin or what's been going on with that, I'm just going to do a very, very high level summary of the relevant points with respect to Bitcoin, so that I can then move into the analogy as we progress in this video. So one of the things that is really desirable about the Bitcoin technology is that as more people use this system, it becomes more and more difficult to not only attack, but also for centralized actors to take control over that system. And so, this is what's known as censorship resistance, right? The fact that the more people who participate, whereas many other systems tend to get more and more centralized if somebody can take control over a central part of that system. So if they can take control over a government, or if they can take control over a bank, then they can start influencing that system to continuously centralize further and further the power to a very small subset of the people within the network. And Bitcoin is one of our first hypotheses as humanity with respect to how to build a system that allows us to transact value while retaining a certain degree of tension, a pull, to prevent us from continuously centralizing that system. And when you centralize that system, all sorts of bad side effects follow from that. And so regardless of whether one is an investor in Bitcoin or loves Bitcoin or hates Bitcoin or whatever, one can at least acknowledge that there's value in these ideas of having a balance between centralization and decentralization, and a system that can use certain mathematical tools to ensure that balance persists across time. Okay. There are also trade-offs. You don't get that for free. So while we really want these properties of the system of Bitcoin, they come at a cost. And one of those costs is the fact that, as many people who are in this world of decentralized technologies will know, and for those who don't, the cost is speed. And because of the way that the system operates, there are fundamental upper bounds on how quickly information can flow through this network. For certain needs, that's okay. It doesn't necessarily matter if one person is buying a home in Bitcoin and it takes 5 hours or 10 hours for that clearance to go through, for that transaction to go through, that's still actually exponentially better than what we have to do today in terms of dealing with our banking systems and the lag inherent in those systems. But that speed is not actually useful, or it's a drag on other types of behavior. So it's a drag on behavior such as buying coffee is the canonical example here. So these small types of transactions that happen all over the economy, within our nation every single day, as you buy your coffee from Starbucks, or as you purchase something on iTunes, or when you buy a piece of clothing from your favorite online store or in person, all of these little microtransactions that are happening, millions or billions of times a day throughout the world, that is not actually something that this core system of Bitcoin is well designed for, as it is in its initial architecture. And that's intentional. That's not an unintentional drawback. It's completely by design, and it was anticipated. So what in the hell does this have to do with gender? And why am I talking about this? So to solve this problem, the Bitcoin community, to solve this problem of slowness, to solve this problem of the fact that there's this inherent upper bound, this inherent ceiling against which the growth of this technology is bumping up against, they've introduced something called a tier 2 layer. And this tier 2 layer, more colloquially known as the Lightning Network, is a network that sits on top of Bitcoin, that rides atop the Bitcoin underlying infrastructure, and it provides a certain type of extension of the behaviors and capacities of the Bitcoin network to solve some of the problems and limitations of the Bitcoin network. But it does so without forcing the Bitcoin network at that first tier to compromise the integrity of its system, such that it can keep providing the guarantees and benefits that it had been providing for a very long period of time. And that Lightning Network has very different rules, and it's a much more fluid network. It's a much more dynamic space in which you can transact at a much higher frequency in ways that don't necessarily impose the constraints of the fundamental first layer or first tier of the Bitcoin world onto the people who are only interacting with that second tier. So you can actually build a network on top of Bitcoin using the Lightning Network that allows for an emergent economy of many billions or trillions of microtransactions to actually occur, while still having all the same guarantees of that first tier. Now that I've talked about that, the parallel might start coming to your mind, because if you think about where we are as a culture, and if you think about how the conversation has developed around the concept of gender itself, we have to realize that the concept of gender was not always a concept that humanity had. It was not always a word, or not always something that we actually needed to use or consciously discuss as a term. Well, why did it arise? Well, it seems to have arisen because of the fact that the first layer of language that we used to start discussing these kinds of topics was much more designed. It emerged as a way of speaking about aspects of our behavior that were far more obvious, that were far more salient. If you look at the dynamics of men and women as we move from less complex societies to more complex societies, there are certain aspects of our behavior that are more categorically what we might call male or female. So like the capacity to give birth is the perfect example of this. And so, especially in a pre-technological society where not only did only the women have the capacity to give birth, but there wasn't even the concept that we might be able to change that in the way that, in some ways, that concept exists now. And so we kind of see that this system, in the same way that there's this fundamental Bitcoin system at the tier 1 layer, humanity created its own tier 1 infrastructure of language, a tier 1 linguistic infrastructure, to be able to discuss, at least at the first order level of complexity, the dynamics that were occurring between what we called men and what we called women. And if we can put our ideologies aside for a second, it makes intuitive sense that this was the first thing that humanity began to wrap language around. These were the first behaviors that we started to try to take from the realm of physical embodied behavior and move into the realm of abstract concept and language. And so we generated this binary language around sex. And then we progressed, and civilizations got, one might say, exponentially more complex. And we started noticing that in these new types of worlds that we're creating for ourselves, so in a 21st century technologically infused world where we've removed many of the fundamental constraints that governed and limited our previous modes of behavior as humans, as these categories we call men and women in this first tier language system, we realized that these might not necessarily be adequate when we're talking about the greater level of complexity of human behavior in this new space. And that's very similar to the way that the first tier Bitcoin system was not necessarily designed to accommodate the type of speed and granularity and fluidity of transactions within itself, but we added a second tier layer to that network to be able to handle it. And much the same way, humanity literally created a second tier category to sit atop the concept of sex that we call gender. And this is where things get very ideologically tense, right? This is where we have so many debates and so many rage fests online. So many people get at each other's throats so quickly without thinking this through and thinking about how to maintain the structured separation between these two levels of our reality. And you might note that if you do watch my other videos, this is actually exactly what I was talking about in my last video, which was the Ontology of Emergence. I'll put the link in the description for those who haven't seen it and want to catch up on that. But what I was talking about in brief was the fact that as systems emerge and create these different tiers or layers, the last thing that we want to do is use the language from one layer to talk about the other layer or conflate the two. Because if we conflate the two, what we're doing there is destroying useful information about the structure of the system and why and how it emerged and its behavior. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to be destructive to our own nature, to our own emergent reality. We want to be able to understand the contours of that reality as best as we possibly can so that we can move forward in ways that allow for as many people as possible to express the full potential that they have inside them, regardless of the categories that we place on top of them. I mean, I think anybody can agree on that, is that we would like people to be able to realize their potential. I don't think that is a controversial statement in and of itself. It gets controversial when we start cramming all of these different concepts from different tiers into one space. And so what I'm trying to say here is that we've created a category of gender. And what's happening is that a large amount of our society who was very used to the operations of that first tier language system, the tier system of male and female, which maps very closely to the layer underneath that, which is more closely associated with our older evolutionary history and our biological features, what one would call in the scientific realm our phenotypic expression of all of these complex underlying systems, which does itself separate into two bimodal categories, which doesn't mean that there's only inside or outside the categories. It means that it's kind of like a mountain range, and there are mountain peaks, and then there are also valleys, and there's a gradient there. So we need to keep all of this in mind when we're thinking about these systems. And so what we're doing here is trying to find a way of creating this second tier infrastructure to discuss the concept of gender, to discuss the idea that in a modern world where things have become exponentially more complex and where many of the previous constraints that governed our prior behavior across the evolutionary domain, where those have been in many ways relaxed or released or even reversed, how does that impact the dynamics between the human beings that grow up in this world? And do we need a second tier to be able to deal with those dynamics at a higher level of resolution, at a higher level of specificity? Because much like, I was talking about in my video about not forcing it, called Don't Force It, what happens when you apply a low resolution ideology or a low resolution framework to a high resolution world is that you end up damaging the system. It's like trying to put the square block into the round hole. If you just force that, it's indicative of the fact that you don't really understand what's going on. And so when you don't necessarily understand what's going on, perhaps because the world is changing so quickly and so many aspects of our reality are transforming before our very eyes, perhaps we need to take a step back and understand and develop better systems for discussing the way in which we may need to implement a framework around a more granular form of gender identity expression. Now, what that does not mean is that that emergent layer completely supplants the first layer of terminology that connects gender to the underlying evolutionary and biological realm. We don't want to remove that. We don't want to blow that out. In the same way that if we hop back over to the Bitcoin world, the last thing that the Lightning Network actually wants is to destroy the Bitcoin network, because it actually rides on top of the Bitcoin network. So what we're seeing here, in a way, is this pathology in our culture where we're not able to sufficiently integrate and understand the concept that the notion of gender depends upon, emerges out of, and really grows out of, fundamentally, in a deeply scientific sense, grows out of the concept of sex as expressed through our behavior and reproduction throughout our evolutionary history. And what's happening is that the people who are advocates of that tier 2 gender system, what they're doing is they're feeling the pull from those who are uncomfortable growing out into that new space of higher complexity, which is natural for humans because we don't like uncertainty. Uncertainty is this thing that completely erodes our capacity to feel safe and stable. And generally speaking, when you inject a huge amount of uncertainty into someone's world, they're going to react. And so in many ways, the people who are holding on to the first tier language system around sex are then triggering a response in the people who are trying to advocate for the second tier system of gender. And then the second tier system of gender are responding by effectively attempting to completely negate the conceptual infrastructure that they perceive as their enemy, because they perceive it within the framework of a battle, of a tug of war between left and right. They don't understand because they haven't been taught. It's not their fault that they don't understand, because almost nobody thinks this way. This is not the way our schools teach us. This is not the way that people are generally taught to interpret the world. This is not the way that all the talking heads and idiots on television tell us to think about our conceptual structure and our political reality. No, nobody really, not nobody, but very few people really see the world this way. So we can't blame them for not understanding that this is how the world operates. What we need to do is help create tools for educating, help create tools for understanding how to connect these two layers in a constructive way so that we can allow people to express their gender or their identity in a very diverse manner. But that does not by itself or by its nature or by its operation negate the underlying infrastructure, the underlying tools that humanity has already tried to, or that humanity has already created, and that many systems depend upon. So for example, the medical system. The medical system is such a complex space. Like, I've just started working over the past couple of years on a project in the medical space, and the amount of complexity in that space is insane. And the concepts of male and female are baked so deeply into the medical world, rightly so, because so much of what the medical world deals with are the physical properties that have a lot to do with the asymmetries between what we call male and female. If you try to remove that, if you blow out that language layer, if you blow out the conceptual infrastructure around male and female in the name of creating a higher order second tier system, you're going to do irreparable damage. You're going to completely blow out the foundations of your house, thinking that you're doing a renovation, which is an insane thing to do. And I'm not calling the people who seek to create a better way of expressing gender insane. I'm just saying that there needs to be a better understanding of the fact that the expression of gender at a higher resolution can coexist and in fact depends upon the acknowledgement and underlying reality of biological emergence, evolutionary emergence, and the way that that has initially lensed itself through our first order approximations of what it means to be male or female. Now that doesn't mean that male and female category doesn't have blurry edges, or that those categories can't themselves grow out into the second tier in a way that overlaps. And in fact, that is likely what we're seeing right now because of the fact that our new world, our new technological reality allows us to express so many more parts of our internal systems, of our internal being than we could before. We can express ourselves in infinitely more ways than we ever could have previously. And not only can we express ourselves in those ways, when we do express ourselves in those ways, it's connected to infinitely more people in the network of human beings. And therefore we need to have a better system that allows for those projections of our internal identities at a second order gender layer to smoothly in a frictionless manner, or at least a reduced friction mode of being, interact with that first order system instead of trying to destroy it. And so that's why I think it's really informative for us to think of the fact that it's not just Bitcoin. I mean, I use that because it's expedient, because a good amount of people are starting to understand this. But I made a video a while back that's also on my channel called Bitcoin, a star, a planet, and a forest. And I used different metaphors to talk about what Bitcoin represented in a similar way in terms of naturalistic metaphors. And one of the metaphors I used there was the forest. And I was talking about trees and how the tree has a root system, which is like the tier 1 infrastructure, but then there's an entire network of fungus, or what they call a mycelial network, in the forest floor that allows for the tree roots to extend their reach, because the fungal network or the mycelial network actually creates a trade network with the roots of the trees, which is crazy. And this is what people are starting to consider like the internet of the forest. And so what I'm getting at there is that these patterns are not localized. These are general patterns in terms of the way that information or energy flow between different types of systems within networks. And if we can understand that that's the case, and if we can teach people that that is the case, and show them that this is the case, and show them that these are not things that are fundamentally at odds with one another. These are not spaces where we need to be at each other's throats. Actually, no, this is a function of our natural, healthy growth as a species into a fundamentally more complex domain. And we need to manage the tension between the constraints and the side effects and the trade-offs that occur at each one of these emergent layers of the system itself. And so this is where the conversation needs to be. And unfortunately, it's nowhere close. And so I'm trying to see this information out there, and I hope that, if this resonates with you, please share it. Please share it with those you've seen arguing incessantly about the idea of gender, especially those who are interested in Bitcoin, because they'll inherently get this. It will resonate at a deep level. So, let's try to create better ways of talking about these concepts that aren't just words. They're words and concepts that actually they do a better job of mapping onto the real systems that give rise to them. And if we can actually look at reality, if we can look with clear eyes, and if we can actually have, while we're looking with that clarity, if we can actually still maintain a connection to our empathy, and we can look at those systems and create language to discuss it, and that language is the type of language that helps us create pragmatic solutions and comes together. It's an attractor as opposed to a polarizing force. Then we might actually be able to get through this without some sort of massive collapse, or as we're calling it, a culture war, without that culture war turning into real war. And unfortunately, we're seeing the beginnings of that throughout our culture. And so we need better tools. And I hope that this can be a better tool. And if you think it's a better tool, let me know and please share it around. Thanks a lot. Bye.